Let's talk about how to draw a cityscape. Looking at my recent work, I realized I've been drawing a lot of city backgrounds. Backgrounds I feel are more technical than intuitive. So once you know the techniques, anyone can draw them easily. Today I've prepared 2 drawings, both at a beginner level. To follow along easily, download the free brushes from my profile link before we start the tutorial. First, let's briefly go over the whole process. Lay down the base color, draw the distant mountains, shape the buildings, then add the city lights. Okay, before we start, one crucial concept. I often see drawings with great shapes and details, but a disappointing final result. Often the perspective is off. When drawing backgrounds, I check 3 things. Size, contrast, and haze. Closer objects are larger and sharper, farther ones are smaller and blurrier. While drawing, periodically check your work against these principles. I am not formally trained, so today's content is solely based on my experience. So view this as a helpful method from my experience, not a definitive answer. On the screen, I'm showing how simple building shapes are expressed based on whether they're close, in the middle, or far away. First, fill the canvas with a base color. Now let's draw the mountains. Lately, I've been using the haze brush a lot when drawing distant mountains. I paint once, then erase the top to shape it. The haze brush has a cloud-like spreading feel, which is great for naturally capturing the details of distant mountains. I personally think it's a fun technique. I'll add a simple tower on top of the mountain. I wanted to create a Seoul city vibe, so I added a little something like Namsan Tower. Next, let's draw the city buildings, beginning with those in the distance. Use the rectangle brush to stamp them in. The important thing here is to avoid making it look too uniform. Adjust the pen pressure to make some stamps lighter and others darker. Now let's make the brush a bit bigger and the color darker to stamp in the foreground buildings. Try to avoid uniformity as much as possible here. As a reference, I've prepared an example of how awkward it looks when drawn too uniformly. In such cases, use the rectangle brush to slightly erase the tops of the buildings. This alone makes it much more natural and diverse. Did you notice? As the buildings get closer, they get bigger and their color gets darker. This is the key point of this drawing. Finally, to break up the uniform feel even more, I'll paint over it with the haze brush and then clean it up by partially erasing with the rectangle brush. Distant objects are unclear. Depicting that well makes the perspective pop. Soon I'll also show an example where inverting the colors looks awkward. Darker distant colors seem fine initially, but that's a trap. Lightening foreground colors makes it awkward. Now we'll depict the city lights utilizing the window brush. You don't need to draw each window to fit the buildings. Just paint over the entire building shape we've established. Next, I'll make the rectangle brush smaller and erase the windows vertically. It's okay to draw roughly since most of it will be erased anyway. Now let's clean up the windows we've made with the rubble brush. When erasing, simply ensure remaining parts naturally fit the background building shapes. This process will significantly cut down on the remaining windows. Then just repeat, covering them with the window brush, erasing vertically, and tidying up with the rubble brush. Ensure that the closer buildings have a greater number of visible windows. In essence, this technique involves establishing building silhouettes and then subtly incorporating light effects. Beginners can easily approach this. Applying these techniques yields great results. Additionally, use a brush that makes dots like sand particles, or draw the dots yourself to add small lights to the city. At the end, adjust the opacity to make it look natural. Finally, a touch of haze brush between buildings makes the city lights pop. If you followed along, it's done. Easier than expected, right? Alright, on to the next drawing. We'll create the city's overall form and then add the city lights. Then we draw the planet and stars, then adjust perspective and atmosphere. Okay, let's begin. Fill the canvas using the rectangle brush. When you do this, draw the squares so they aren't too uniform. These squares will become the roofs of the city buildings. If shapes are uniform, it's odd. Draw them irregularly. Then, reduce the size of the green rectangles, hold Alt, and drag them sideways to copy. Repeat this process to fill the horizontal space, and then I'll merge the layers into one. This time we'll follow the same procedure, copying downwards to gradually fill up the entire canvas. It takes a long time, so I just copied and pasted. However, copying can leave a repetitive pattern. So I'll use the rectangle brush to break up the uniformity by erasing parts here and there. This is the process of creating roads in the city. Imagine you're looking down from above and draw as if you're planning roads on a map. Too many roads can look awkward, and too few can look sparse. Just try to match the amount you see here. Now I'm going to select all the layers we have drawn so far and transform them. When stretching horizontally, extend it sufficiently for a clear front to back size contrast. This helps create good perspective. Now to the sides of the buildings. The key here is to use a color that's darker than the roofs, and as you get closer, make your brush size bigger. That will make the perspective much clearer. If the density of the roofs you drew at first doesn't look like this, I recommend redoing it at this stage. It doesn't look good if it's too empty or too crowded. Now let's paint the background. First, move the yellow road layer behind the buildings, then erase some with a rectangle brush to tidy it up. Now let's draw the building windows. The process is almost the same. This time, as we're viewing the cityscape from afar, use a smaller window brush. This time I'm not going to bother erasing vertically. At this distance, that level of detail isn't very important. Just use the rubble brush to erase and check if the city lights look natural. If it still looks dim after erasing, just fill them in again. Finally, use the sand particle brush to add some small round lights here and there. Use small dots for distant areas and slightly larger ones for closer areas. Make the Pen 60 brush large and draw as if you're making two dots. Adjust the position and size to fit the screen. Clean up parts that overlap the city with an eraser. Now I'll clean up the airbrush. Imagine a clock and erase everything except the area between 8 and 12 o'clock. This will give you a nice spherical shape. I'm going to lightly define the edge with a bright airbrush, and using a clipping mask makes it much cleaner. Using the Shape Creation tool, draw another circle. Then by applying Free Transform to adjust it, much like in the video, you will be able to create the planet's rings. Adjust the size, then erase hidden parts. For the rings overlapping section, use a rectangle brush, varying pen pressure to create a natural look. I'll use the sand particle brush to draw stars, then add a touch of airbrush at the very back of the city for a setting sun effect. Next, I'll adjust the opacity, then use the haze brush to refine distant elements. It subtly blurs distant elements, lending the planet a more mysterious air. Lastly, I'll add some grass elements to the canvas's outer edge. I'll make a large mark with the rubble brush and apply a Gaussian blur. This technique helps draw more focus to a character if you place one in the center. So I've created two different backgrounds. Both are ideal for centering a character. It will look even cooler if you add them in as a silhouette. I hope this video made perspective and city backgrounds feel a bit easier. Thank you.